Who the hell's Vulcan? Oh, it's the new one. No, Vulcan. Oh, okay. Dawson's Rentals. Hey YouTube, Dawson Rider here. Welcome to my ranking of every secondary rider so far in the modern era, in honor of the fact that we just sort of recently had our debut of Valen. It's been about a week since we debuted Valen when I'm recording this. I'm not sure when it's going to go up, but probably within a week or two, it just depends, but I was a little bit late on getting this together because I had a couple other videos I needed to get out first, but I wanted to do, kind of like I have been doing, a ranking in honor of like a theme going on, which is the secondary rider. I've already talked about my thoughts and rankings on the suits. I'll leave that probably linked here a couple times. But this is going to be about the characters, and I think it's pretty clear-cut. There's probably going to be a debate about, and if I have someone on here that's technically the fifth rider, whatever, who cares? It's just supposed to be fun. But I'm sure there'll be some categorization talk in the comments. But let's go ahead and get started. And I hate to have this one at the bottom, because it feels like in almost every video, even now that it's over, I end up dunking on Gatak in some way. I could be reviewing Dragon Ball. I'm like, welcome to the review for Daima's first episode. Man, Gatak sucked, didn't it? But I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, but my least favorite is Rin, Kamen Rider Majade. Not because I hated her character, it's not like a Hotaro situation where he would be on the bottom of this list because, yes, I do hate that character, but Rin just kind of fell flat for me. And maybe it'll change in the years to come, but I don't foresee it just because it's not one of those ones that I see me like having rose-colored glasses and looking back on fondly. Like all these other characters I either liked more or have had just more time to digest what I thought about them. So for me, it's just Rin, my opinion on her just fell flat. She wasn't honestly terrible. I just recently talked about her in another video. I think it was in this week's, or one of the recent videos for Gav comparing the female characters. But I talked about how a lot of people criticized her almost as heavily as Gatak, and for her performance. But for me, she just kind of fell flat. But I don't want to talk about it anymore. For that, maybe controversially, because this is a fairly known writer, but just Kaisa. I've just never been a big fan. I know Kaisa's whole shtick is being a jerk. I think he does a good job at being a character you kind of love to hate, but sometimes it just kind of leans more to being annoyed by him, which is why he's so low on the list. It's not one of those characters, again, similar to someone like Hotaro, where it's on the bottom of the list because I have a hatred for him. I've just never cared for the character. The only reason he like edged out a little above Rin is just because he's a little bit more memorable, and again, Rin just fell flat. Like, I'd rather feel nothing, or feel something than nothing, if that makes any sense. Coming in next is Garen. Garen is funny because early on, before like I even watched the show, do you even watch the show? I liked his suit. Like, I gravitated towards his suit. I think my favorites from that now are Chalice and King Blade, but that was like my first suit that I latched onto, and I really liked his character at the beginning, and I didn't hate his character. I thought it was actually really interesting what they did with him, having him be the mentor at the start, and then it's like, oh, he betrayed them, but he didn't. But the only reason he kind of fell down on the list, again, not a character that's like he's at the bottom because I hate him. In fact, I don't think there's any characters that are lower on this list that I hate. Like, there's sometimes rankings where you'll have a series or a character or a villain or whatever that's on the list at the bottom because you hate him, but all of these are just kind of least favorites. And for me, the thing with Garen is I felt that in the second half of the series, after everything came out about like what the betrayal was about, it felt like he was always needlessly against the characters just for conflict. Like, I could kind of understand why he disagreed with Blade with certain stuff like Chalice, because that was the core conflict of the series, but sometimes it felt like it was just an argument for argument's sake, like just kind of one of those things I can't stand where they're just constantly manufacturing conflicts, and I don't know, he kind of annoyed me in the second half. Next up is Iuki. Iuki's kind of, in a way, I hate to say it, a forgettable character. I think I talked about in my suit video that I really have come around to his suit. Like, I like his suit a lot. If I ever find a good deal for his figure art, I'll probably get it. He's not the most memorable or exciting character, especially in a series like Hibiki, where I love the main character so much, and characters like Todoroki and Zanki were so, I almost went Zero-Man now, Todoroki and Zanki were so memorable. For me, though, Ibuki's fine. I thought he was likable enough. I think the thing that I like most about him, which is why he ranked a little bit higher than the ones lower on the list, is I did think it was kind of an interesting juxtaposition for the first and second riders, where usually it's some sort of like different philosophy that has to do with the battle or fighting or whatever, but in this case it was the fact that for most of the series, Hibiki didn't want to pass on his knowledge to a student, and Ibuki's whole story was about his student. And that was just kind of an interesting mirror compared to the usual mirror we'll sometimes get with first and second riders. After that is Deend. Deend is just kind of a wild card. He's kind of fun sometimes kind of annoying, and I just like him okay for that. Like, he's pretty low on the list just because he can be so unpredictable, which is fun. But sometimes, I'll be honest, I can get kind of tired of it. It feels like every time you see him, whether it's you haven't seen him in a while and it's in a different movie, or even within the series, he's on a different side, which is his shtick, but it just kind of got old for me, and I've always just kind of liked him okay. It's kind of like Kaisa in a way, where I sometimes find myself more annoyed than liking him, but I think just because his kind of appearances are so varied, where I could like him one minute, hate him the next, it makes him a little bit more entertaining. Following that up with Spectre, Spectre was such a weird character. Like, I almost don't even know where to start. Like, in a way, he was just kind of the generic, used to be the protagonist's friend, sort of a mentor-y role, but sometimes disagreed with him. Very generic, like nothing unlikable about him. But I felt his story just got weird. I felt like they kind of didn't know what to do with him, and then when they did stuff with him, that sounded weird, but you know what I mean? Like, when they did stories with him, it just got very weird. So, like, I just ranked him here because it felt right in terms of how much I liked the characters. But I'll just say my two main thoughts about this character was he was either generic or his storyline was really strange. Like, I'm going to be honest, I don't even remember it that well, but I just remember his V-Cinema story where he got that sick final form being weird. But I still want to figure out for that, though. How have they not made it? Unless they haven't, I'm just too stupid to know. Vulcan, yes, Vulcan from, my god, I forgot this name too. Zero One. Vulcan was fine. I liked the actor fine. I think he performed the part well. He had a pretty generic backstory of being against, like, the enemy because he had a bad past with them. I didn't find there to be anything revolutionary about him, but I liked him okay. Honestly, my only, like, thing that I didn't like about him was about the twist that his memories of being attacked by Humagears were manufactured. I hated the Humagear propaganda, and I feel more justified in that in, like, the era where we should not be supporting AI. But I just wasn't a fan of that, mainly because it seemed like they were just trying to prop the Humagears up, and it's like, why are you, like, washing their backstory that they never had this incident? Humagears literally attack people every week. It's part of the premise. I felt he still could have come around and seen the other side and seen that Humagears aren't all bad without erasing his backstory. In fact, I think that just contributed to one of my problems with the series is I think there's a valid debate where I would have liked to have him seen, like, okay, maybe they're not all bad, but also have Aruto acknowledge, like, yeah, you actually had a bad experience and there are some bad ones. So that was the only negative thing I had about him, was that twist, but it didn't necessarily have anything to do with his character in a way. Next up, Axel. I just like Axel fine. Like, honestly, I don't really have anything positive or negative to say about him that's, like, exceptionally interesting. I thought it was kind of cool to have, like, a cop character as a juxtaposition to sort of the freelance PI investigator storyline, and he did a good job of, like, riding the line of being able to be stern and kind of a badass, but also lean into the silly moments. But I feel like I just don't have a normal amount to say. This is another one where when I was making the list, I'm like, this just feels right. I liked Axel fine. Just above that, I put Meteor, and I struggled actually in a way with this positioning because I would argue in some ways I like Axel's character more, and I like Double more. But the reason I put Meteor above it is I did find it to be a really interesting twist to have this character kind of being undercover in the Kamen Rider Club, and then having this grudge against Forze, and then having that big dramatic story where he thought he killed him. It was a lot of interesting soap opera-y stuff, but I really liked that. Like, he got to know the group while secretly there, and then they didn't know he was Meteor. I just found that to be a pretty interesting dynamic, and one of the more interesting parts about the Forze series, so I was a little bit more interested in his character, so I wanted to give him a little bit higher ranking. Next up is Brave. This is the secondary rider from Xaid. Honestly, in a lot of ways, also a little bit of a generic character in terms of his archetype, but I did like him. This was another case where I thought there was room for, like, an interesting debate, as, like, especially at the beginning of the series, you had Xaid being like, we need to get to know the patients and all this stuff, and then meanwhile Brave was very clinical, like, let's just find the problem and solve it. And I thought that was another situation that, again, annoyed me in the series, where I was like, nope, the main character is the only person that knows what he's talking about. But I wish there would have been a middle ground there, because there could have been a cool debate there of, like, okay, yes, it is good to get to know your patients, you can find out more information and you can find something vital, but sometimes time might be of the essence and you might need to cut it into a clinical style. And I thought there would have been a good debate there. But Brave, I think, was a solid secondary writer, where he kind of had that classic role of having kind of differing opinions from the main character, but of course he comes around in some ways, and yeah, I liked Brave. Following that up with G3, now I forgot to mention that for this list, I'm counting, like, the main person to hold the mantle. There are a couple on here where there were several different people to don the mantle, and I might mention them briefly if I am feeling like it or if it comes up naturally, but I'm counting, like, the main person that is the character. So, like, there was one other person that briefly became the main G3, and then at the end like the other guy inherited the old G3 system. But I'm mainly talking about the main character, G3, G3X, and I always just really liked this guy. He was on the opposite side of Agito because he was like of law enforcement and official Kamen Rider, whereas Agito's a vigilante. But I like that he was never like one of those like flying off the handle, like we have to stop Agito because he's a rogue element. Like from the beginning, he recognized like, oh, Agito's helping, and he was just kind of like an all-around good guy that was reasonable with a level head on his shoulders. And I liked his arc when he like briefly lost the mantle and got to come back. It felt satisfying. He's kind of just like an understated character where it's not like, oh my god, he was the most amazing character in the series, but he was just a really solid secondary writer. Next up is Gates from Geo. This was another one where my feelings on the series mixed into the feelings on the character. Like, he's the worst Terminator of all time, to be honest with you. He got convinced like upwards of 1,000 times in the series to not kill his target when he could have just ended the series in the debate in episode 1, but then you wouldn't have a series. But I did like Gates. Like, as a character, I didn't ever find him really that annoying. Definitely some of the storytelling and decisions sometimes got on my nerves, but like there was never a point where I hated him. And kind of like with Meteor, I did find the dynamic to be interesting. Like, he comes back to the past to kill this guy that's responsible for killing his timeline, but then finds out there might be a chance to save it in a more peaceful way and befriends him. They didn't always pull it off great, but it's admittedly an interesting dynamic that kept me engaged. It'd be like if Trunks went back to the past and then befriended Android 17. I guess it's kind of like Terminator in a way, where you have them befriending the T2 unit. But you know what I mean. It was an interesting dynamic. Interesting dynamic. Following that up with Evil Live, this was another one I kind of struggled with, because if I'm being honest, in certain aspects of the character, particularly the live side of it, he kind of annoyed me a lot, especially in the arc where you had like GIF and the like president guy that was with him is like, you're my family, and he was like going against the family in a really egregious way where it's like, this is the only way we win. And he could just be really obnoxious with it sometimes. Like, a lot of the time, that was a character that did annoy me, like the good side of him. But I really liked his character story. Like, one of my favorite things about Revice was about how it represented each of the characters' struggles with their own demons differently. Like, it presented differently for every character based on what they had, you know. Revice, I think, was mainly about working with your demons. John was about insecurity. And his was about trying to suppress his demons, kind of like his father did in a way, and showing that you can't do that, that you have to work with it and work through it. And I thought that was really well done. I wasn't a fan of him personally. I found him annoying a lot, but I thought his character story was one of the most successful in showcasing one of my favorite themes of that series. After that is Blades from Saber. This was a character who was also a very generic, kind of like by the book, kind of is sort of opposing the more freeform style and free thinking of Saber. And it was a character I always liked alright, and he was kind of the most on the side of Logos, you know, when they were doing that whole, oh, there's a mole arc, or whatever. I came to appreciate his character more during the endgame time, and then when I watched his special, as it kind of made more sense once you learn that, like, he didn't really have a family, he lost his family, so Logos became his family, and that, like, explained why he was so loyal to them to a fault, because it was all he had, and his arc was kind of about breaking free of that and finding these new connections, and I did kind of enjoy that, and I kind of developed a soft spot for him once I started to understand his character. Next up, at tentative placement, is currently Valen. This could go higher or lower depending on where we're at. We're only, like, a little bit less than 10 episodes into the series as of this recording, but I really like him so far. He's a very likable character, much like our main character in a way. Like, he's a very different personality, but he does a good job of being able to be silly and fun when he calls for those moments for him to be in a comedic situation. Like, not like silly and fun, but you know what I mean? Like, he can do comedic scenes, but he can also be cool, but he also kind of has that, like, everyman mentality. And what I like most about him is he does have that generic Toku backstory of like, oh, my parent or sibling or neighbor was killed by a monster, so I'm gonna get into this, but then of course his mentor is killed. But I like that he's level-headed, at least at the moment of this recording. He doesn't fly off the handle. He very easily could have been a character that started screaming at the top of his lungs and punching Gav because he's somehow related to the enemy, but I like that he actually has a level head in the whole situation, and it's been refreshing. But it's too early to give in-depth thoughts, but this is his tentative placement. Next up is Beast. Honestly, the thing I remember most about Beast is mayonnaise. I always felt his character sort of fell by the wayside. It felt like he was included because they had to include a secondary writer. Like, after he debuted, I don't remember him having any main significance to the plot, but I always found him to be likable. I thought the mayonnaise shtick was fun, and I liked the way his powers worked as like an ancient version of the way Wizard worked, where Wizard internalized the demon and could channel that magic, but he literally like trapped the demon in the driver and had to feed it. I thought that was cool. Or the demon. Did I say the demon? What were they called? Phantoms? Next up is Mach. Mach was a very okay character, a bit all over the place, where sometimes I liked him, sometimes he got on my nerves a little bit. I really liked his costume a lot. One of my favorite suits, though. I'm a sucker for a modern retro aesthetic, as I've mentioned before on this channel. What I liked most about him, though, is I did like his storylines with his friendship with Chaser near the end, but also I liked his little self-aware arc when Drive was starting to get all kinds of power-ups and all he had was type dead heat. In fact, he never even got any more upgrades really until his V-Cinema. I mean, you had that sort of hybrid form in the finale, but I thought that was just funny because, like, obviously we know the main character is always getting more power-ups. Although in the era that would follow him, secondary and third riders would get more power-ups. But still, it was just kind of a funny, like, meta way of acknowledging that the main character always gets the power-ups, but turning it into a character motivation, which I thought was kind of fun. Following that up with Gatak, who is the 5th rider to debut, I believe, in this series, but he counts as the secondary rider. He was just always a likable character for me. Kind of reminds me of the dynamic of Geats and Tycoon, where you have him almost feeling more like the classic quote-unquote everyman protagonist of Rider, so that you can have a douche protagonist, so you still have a little bit of that gateway in there. But he was kind of that classic story of you finally got to watch him work up to being a rider, and he always kind of had this respect and friendship with Tendo, but also always had like a little bit of tension with their differing ideals. But he was always just, I think, a very solid secondary rider, and I like that arc of having a character there that's kind of around from the beginning, almost like a B side character in a way that became a rider. I always thought that was kind of cool. Following that up, speaking of, with Tycoon, that dynamic there, having him kind of fill in for what would almost traditionally feel like the archetype of the main rider, but allowing you to have a douchebag rider. But I liked Keiwa's arc, especially, like, he did fly a little bit off the handle there with his Bujin arc there, but that was kind of cool to see. But once it came around, like, it was cool to have that character where you have that sort of more heroic motivation compared to Geats at the beginning, and I thought he sold it a lot more believable than other protagonists that can come across disingenuous. But also, when you get into the story of the villains, which was one of my favorite parts about this series, of the viewers, of his story about being that character, wanting to get him to become a rider and giving him that classic tragic backstory, was rather interesting. And there was some mixed parts, but for the most part, I always liked Keiwa. Next up is Baron, very much that classic, like, I don't like you, but I have respect for you type of secondary rider where you have this frenemy relationship. I still think his heel turn at the end felt like it was out of nowhere in a way. Maybe I need to rewatch it. But I think he made one of the better, very classic secondary riders where you have that believable dynamic where I could believe the love-hate relationship between the two of them. Up next is Knight, kind of the template for what I think of often with a secondary rider, that sort of colder badass that has a reluctant, like, respect for the main character, or a respect that develops over the series, but they're always kind of at odds. But I always thought he was just very much that classic cool character you kind of fall for. It's always the bad boys. No, but you kind of fall for that character as just a cool character. He's meant to be cool, and you're kind of a sucker for it because you think he's cool. And I said cool so many times there. But I always loved the push-pull dynamic of that he continued to get closer to Shinji despite the fact that he knew he would have to fight him because he had to save his fiancée, and I thought that was an interesting dynamic. Interesting dynamic. After that is Birth. I really do like both Goto and Date. I like that overall story about how they passed the torch there. I think that was very well done. So in a way, this slot goes to both of them and their overall story, but mainly it's Date. I mean, have you seen his abs? But also, at the time, I remember thinking, like, I felt like we were going to build towards Goto being Birth. Why are we bringing in this random guy? And he wound up being one of the most likable characters in the show. One of my favorite Toku characters, period, in terms of just likability. And like I said, I really like the way his mentorship and friendship, like, developed with Goto. Alright, for these last three I had to make a second recording because I had to stop to charge the batteries, and then the second file accidentally got deleted, so I had to re-record it, but thankfully I'm an expert at keeping the outfit continuity, so I made sure to meticulously dressed the same way. Anyway, so for the top three, coming in at number 3 is Ixa, which might surprise people because, you know, often Kiva things are very high on the list, which this is, but it's not number 1, like the new Sentai. I can make those jokes now, because past me from like a minute ago doesn't know the new Sentai is going to be called Gojuger, or number 1 Sentai Gojuger. Anyway, Ixa. I still love Ixa, and I was a little bit confused on how to rank this because when I was ranking the characters, I was going for the primary mantle holder, like I said. And this series is a little confusing because you have Otoya, also as I would consider the other prime Ixa in the 1986 timeline, but that doesn't feel like a traditional secondary rider role. He almost felt like a co-protagonist. So I would say for me personally, Otoya is like the secret number 1 of this list if you were to count him, or like number 0, although that makes him kind of sound like a loser. But you know what I mean. So he's my favorite character of all time for Rider, so he would be at the top of this list. But for this list in particular, just counting the ones in the traditional secondary Rider role, I chose Nago for it, which comes in at number 3, which I still like him. And I think the actor did a good job at pulling off badass, but also comedic stuff. Maybe a little bit too much comedic stuff near the end, but I think he filled the role perfectly of a very classic secondary Rider role, where he's still fighting for a good cause, you know, the same cause as our protagonist in a way, but coming at it from a different angle, you know, vampire hunter, very classic, and I think it was very well done, and I still really do love this version of Ixa, but just not as much as Otoya, but that's why it's not number 1. But number 2 is Zeronos. I really like the Zeronos character in general. I think another actor that does a good job of kind of being a badass and like, you know, brooding and stuff like that. I love you so much, I almost forgot to brood! What's that from? Comment down below. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah. I really like the character in general. I like his dynamic with Denebu. That's another thing just in terms of the performance. I think they have a fun buddy dynamic. But also, I really just love his story. Honestly, it feels like sometimes, I think if it wasn't for Ryotaro having the Imagines and those being so iconic, especially Momotaro's, it would feel like Zeronos is the main character of Den-O because so much of the plot revolves around him. And the tragic story of this younger version burning memories of his future self and then running out of those and having to burn memories of his present day self was just such a cool touch on a character I already really liked. But for me, number 1 is Ryuga, Banjo, Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Banjo, Nuts and Bolts, whatever. No, but I got away from myself there. But Kamen Rider Claws, I call him Claws, just whatever. I've heard it both ways. This was, for me, like, it kind of felt like the counterpoint to why I like Kota, aka Gaim, because they had some of the best overall development in terms of what I feel you could chart from the very beginning of the series to the end. And I just really liked his character and how we got to see him evolve from the predicament he found himself in to becoming a hero to his relationship with Sento, which I think is one of my favorite relationships. I think that, like, it was one of the best friendship dynamics in Rider I've ever seen. I don't know why I always think about how Build was the best at doing a friendship dynamic and then Revice was the best at doing the family dynamic. But that relationship was also key to why I loved his character, getting to see that relationship evolve. I also loved like the twists and how he was involved with evil to still feels like the Reverse Flash of Kamen Rider. So I just really loved his character, kind of for like a secondary Rider version of why I like Sento. It just felt like this really great progression, not to mention all the other elements like his backstory and relationship with Sento. But that is just my list, guys. Let me know your list of your favorite secondary writers in the comments as always. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for my videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.